Hello and good morning, evening or afternoon, depending on when you are tuning into this latest panel Susty Talk from Edie, our series of video interviews designed to keep us all feeling a little bit more connected throughout COVID-19 and beyond, and crucially in the run-up to COP26. With less than 100 days left until COP26, we're taking the opportunity to host panels on each of the 5 themes selected by the UK's COP26 unit. And in the case of today, clean transport. Really good timing, fresh off the back of the transport decarbonisation plan. So delighted to have everyone here today. So just going across the screen, I'm going to introduce everyone really briefly before we do fuller introductions. So I've got Ruth Humphrey, who is the Head of Business Development and Strategy at Siemens Mobility, who are kindly sponsoring this session. I have Bruno Muller, the Head of Strategy and Sustainability at Porterbrook. I have Claire Haigh, the Executive Director at Transport Knowledge Hub and CEO at Greener Transport Solutions. Below her on my screen, I have Greg Archer, who is the UK Director for Transport and Environment, long-term friends of Edie. And then last but by no means least, I have Philip Ellis, the CEO and co-founder of Beryl. I think it would be good, I'm well aware of all of you, I've spent ages setting this up, but I think it'd be good to go around the room and just get a brief introduction to everyone's organisations and roles in the order that I went in. So Ruth, could I start with yourself, please?
Yes, of course, and thank you for inviting me to this interesting roundtable. So yes, I'm Ruth Humphrey. As you said, I'm the Head of Business Development and Strategy for Siemens Mobility in the UK and Ireland. So Siemens Mobility covers the full range of transport activities, including customer services, rolling stock, rail automation, electrification, digitalisation, turnkey solutions, and intelligent traffic systems. So across the board, we're covering. And I'm responsible for our decarbonisation strategy in the UK. So the key theme for us very much is that we really believe within Siemens Mobility that we need to go further and faster in our decarbonisation approach, because as a nation we've set ourselves some very challenging targets, and obviously failure at the moment, well, failure is not an option. So we actually published an article in the Times in July, which took the example of electrification within the UK, and if you looked at the number of kilometres of electrification that have been carried out in recent years, we're going to be into the 2060s and 2070s before we actually manage to achieve the net zero railway that's envisaged in the transport decarbonisation plan. So we need to get a bit of a move on that subject. And this was backed up by the IPCC only last week, so in August, where they said unless there was some very immediate reductions to greenhouse gas emissions, we will not manage to stop the increase in greenhouse gas emissions to the 1.5 or even the 2 degree level. It will be too late. So that's a really important point. So as a business, we've set ourselves some very challenging targets in terms of being net zero operationally across Siemens globally, and that incorporates countries like China and the US as well as the UK. So there will be some challenges, but we will get there. And we've also set ourselves some significant targets within the supply chain. But in parallel, we're actually developing a lot of solutions to try and help others deliver their own net zero ambitions, if you like. So just to pick out a few, we're working in the UK on the digitalisation of the East Coast Main Line with Network Rail and the operators. We're focusing very much on alternatively powered trains, using, for example, hydrogen when electrification is not possible. We also have cost-effective electrification when it is possible. And then finally, a slight departure, we're very much focusing on electric road systems, so the e-highway solution, which we've been running as trials in Germany for some time now. So very much looking forward to be part of this roundtable.
Great, thanks so much, Ruth. And I saw Bruno nodding a lot during that, and I know that's because he's working on hydrogen trains and other interesting things like that as well. So Bruno, can I have an introduction from yourself, please?
Of course, and thank you, Sarah, and hello, everyone. Delighted to have the opportunity to take part in this panel discussion on clean transport today. So my name is Bruno Muller. I'm the Head of Strategy and Sustainability at Porterbrook, and Porterbrook is one of the 3 rolling stock leasing companies created at the time of rail privatization in 1994. So we don't operate the train services ourselves, but own and manage a fleet of around 4,000 rail vehicles, which accounts for around a quarter of the national passenger fleet. So since privatization, we have invested over £3 billion in new trains, but our role goes well beyond financing, and we continuously invest in assets to ensure that they remain safe, reliable, cost-effective, and sustainable throughout their economic life of around 35 years. So rail is already a relatively low carbon mode of transport, but there is a lot of work that needs to be done if we are to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. To achieve zero emissions, we'll have to electrify vast amounts of the network. We'll need to address emissions from existing diesel trains, and we will need to develop new types of traction technology to replace diesel, including hydrogen and battery powered trains on sections of the networks which cannot easily be electrified. So Porterbrook is at the forefront of this work on innovation with projects like HydroFlex, which is the UK's first hydrogen powered train. And to do this, we are investing over £20 million in low carbon technologies to accelerate the transition to a fully decarbonised UK rail network.
Great, and I look forward to hearing from you both a little bit more about these technologies later in this conversation. For now, if I could move on to Claire, please, for introductions.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to join this very interesting discussion. So I'm the founder and CEO of Greener Transport Solutions, which is a not-for-profit organisation dedicated to the decarbonisation of transport. And as Sarah mentioned at the time, I'm also Executive Director of the Transport Knowledge Hub, which brings together local authorities, local businesses, local and central government, local enterprise partnerships and other key players to encourage investments that will facilitate inclusive and sustainable economic growth. So our current main focus, very much where we are, both the Transport Knowledge Hub and Greener Transport Solutions, is the development of a manifesto for decarbonising transport, very much on the back of the publication of the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. We're looking to push aspects of that plan further. In particular, we want to use this process of developing this manifesto as an opportunity to build support for some of the politically challenging solutions that will be needed if we are to achieve net zero. So within our work, we're particularly focused on essentially every aspect of how we plan for transport, we believe, is going to need to change. I mean, there's going to be wider changes to the whole economy. We're particularly focused on the importance of behaviour change, on the importance of getting the price signals right to consumers and businesses, crucially to ensuring a fair and just transition to net zero, and very much about strengthening devolution and empowering local leaders to really accelerate decarbonisation, because really that's where a lot of the work is going to happen. So that's what we're up to.
Thank you very much, Claire. And then if I could move on to Greg, please.
Hello, I'm Greg Archer. I'm the UK Director of the environmental group Transport and Environment. Transport and Environment, or T&E, is a federation of over 60 other environmental groups from across Europe, and we work on all forms of moving towards more sustainable transport, but particularly focus upon the technologies that will enable us to reach that, particularly electrification of vehicles, and also the shift to sustainable fuels in the aviation and shipping sectors in particular. We were based in Brussels historically. We recently celebrated our 30th anniversary, but we've now set up 6 national offices alongside our Brussels team. And here in the UK, we're particularly working on both the shift to new technologies in transport, but also on the pricing and the mode shift issues, the behaviour change issues that will bring about the more rapid decarbonisation of the sector too.
Thanks, Greg, and I'm sure that yourself and Claire will have lots to say about the transport decarbonisation plan. And yes, sorry you're last, Philip, but if I could get an introduction from yourself, please.
Of course, no problem. Hi there. So I'm Philip Ellis. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Beryl. Beryl are the UK's leading micromobility company. So micromobility, just by way of definition, effectively is anything above walking and below public transport. So we operate bikes, e-bikes, e-scooters, e-cargo bikes in shared systems. So we do that in partnership with local authorities, whether we're delivering a system that we own or providing a managed service for large transport authorities in towns and cities throughout the UK. So yeah, we're really targeting with about 26% of greenhouse gas emissions in the UK coming from surface transport. We're really targeting the most inefficient part, those last mile, short journeys, trying to encourage people to make a modal shift away from cars and onto our sustainable vehicles in towns and cities.
Fantastic. And Philip, I'd like to stay with yourself for the first proper question that I have, which is essentially about what it's been like trying to get systems change for transport against the backdrop of the pandemic the past year and a half or so. So we've been tracking this really on a global level with energy. It's pretty clear to see on a UK level. But for example, just this week, we've got a survey of more than 130 councils in the UK from the BBC, finding that 2/3 are finding it harder to deliver some of that on the ground stuff, particularly building retrofit and transport systems change because of COVID, either because of the practicalities or because of the financing or because of the supply chain. So I'd love to hear from yourself what it's been like heading up Beryl at this time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good summary of the challenges in the question, actually. I think you got it. But no, I think, obviously for ourselves and anyone working in transport, the council or the transport authority is at the very least a gateway, and more often than not, the actual end customer of what it is we're doing. I guess, I think the practicalities have been a major part of it. There's a certain number of people who are employed within a local authority or within a transport authority, and overnight, the effort went to maybe not put too fine a point on it, to like maintaining civil order and ensuring that people were not able just to continue to live their lives and receive basic services and health services. And so for the sector that we operate in within micromobility, there might have been a whole tranche of bike share tenders and things like that we were expecting to come through in 2020. But a lot of that would have been sort of pushed back a year or so as the resources, the individuals who were maybe looking to scope that, procure it, run feasibility studies, etc., like they had to make sure the buses were literally running on time, or the trains were running where they could, and things like that. So practicality, I think, was a major part of it. Financing wise, again, I think the same thing. There was just like for businesses, there was a major shock to the system in sort of mid-early 2020. No one quite sure, where the funding was going to come from. Probably also has pushed everyone's timelines back. Do I need to keep this funding available for, things that are very front and centre of mind, like health or adult and social services, versus, implementing a new demand responsive transport system or something like that. So all of that sort of stuff did provide a major shock to the system, and eventually I think probably delayed a load of stuff. Two last things, I guess, I think we have seen policy and infrastructure and an investment reaction to certainly address that, and indeed sort of now hopefully looking forward supercharge some of these activities with funding from government that will allow us all on this call to go about doing what it is we do. And then the second point, very specifically within our industry, what people might have seen, and this was a major boost to our industry, was within the UK, the Department for Transport and the Secretary of State creating effectively a loophole for us to trial electric scooters in our shared systems, and that has meant a very short term, well, or rather a very quick increase in the number of sort of vehicles that we and other operators such as ourselves were able to deploy over the last 12 months. And I think, yeah, the output of that has been a lot of journeys made on these devices, and hopefully a lot of learnings being taken that can be translated into sort of long-term positions of how e-scooters fit within that section of transport that we operate in, from, as I say, in that micro-mobility section. So yeah, I think that has been a definite sort of immediate I suppose benefit, but yeah, there's been some fairly big sort of structural challenges that hit in that first 12 months.
That all makes sense, and I'd like to put that same question really to Bruno and to Ruth as people working on strategy for businesses delivering that. And as you mentioned, Philip, micro-mobility has its own unique set of pros, cons and other bits of context at the moment.
Shall I go first or Bruno? Okay, I mean, the very initial impact was obviously for all businesses a bit of shock and what should happen next. But I actually think then in some ways it's had a positive impact, because it's actually drawn to our attention how we can do things in a different way, in a way that we would not possibly have envisaged 18 months ago. You know, we as a company on the signalling side are now doing design reviews over Teams. If I had suggested that to my colleagues 2 years ago, they would have just laughed at me. You know, we wouldn't have round tables like this because we'd be sat in a room. We couldn't envisage doing that. So I think actually, in a roundabout sort of way, it has been a very difficult and challenging time, but actually it has actually given us the opportunity to try something a bit different, a bit like Philip said. You know, you got that sort of little window to trial e-scooters that probably wouldn't have arrived had the pandemic not been around. So, you know, we've very much carried on with our strategy. So in the middle of the pandemic, we launched with our sister company, Siemens Energy, our sort of, I'll get this right, well-to-wheel strategy for hydrogen trains. So creating clean hydrogen through wind power, through the electrolysis process, and then into hydrogen trains and being able to fuel those hydrogen trains in the same time as the diesel. So we didn't delay launching that because of the pandemic. We very much put it out there because actually people were receptive to those sort of things. And we continue to work on the traffic side on our clean air solutions, because as we've all seen, unfortunately, there's been a real bounce back of people using their own cars, a lot more deliveries with trucks and whatever else. And actually air quality and some of, particularly in cities, has got worse because it's actually there are more users than there were pre-pandemic. So it's very much actually brought things into focus and actually given us the license to push ahead.
Bruno, does any of that resonate with yourself?
Yeah, completely. I fully agree with pretty much everything you've said there, Ruth. I think that, you know, the first impact was such a massive drop in terms of passenger numbers on the railways. In the first lockdown in March 2020, we had up to 95% reduction in passenger numbers, and this is recovering slowly with the easing of restrictions. But at the moment, we're still trending around 60% of pre-pandemic levels. And if you look at the equivalent car journeys, we are back to or even above 100%. So again, rail is a relatively clean mode of transport compared to road. 1% of transport emissions for 10% of passenger miles. So the first challenge really is to get passengers back onto trains, back onto public transport or active modes of travel. But as far as our own decarbonisation strategy is concerned, we haven't had that much delays to any of the programs. We are pressing on with addressing the emissions from the existing diesel trains. This is our hybrid flex project, where we have partnered with Rolls-Royce to fit battery to existing diesel trains, a bit like a hybrid car in the automotive industry, and that reduces carbon emissions by something like 25%. And also allows a last clean mile operation in and around station with significant air quality benefits as well. In parallel, we mentioned the HydroFlex, the hydrogen powered train, a bit earlier. That was launched in 2018, very much progressed as well during the pandemic. It became the first hydrogen train to operate on the UK main line in September 2020. And we see still a big potential there to replace diesel trains where electrification is impractical or not affordable, but also looking outside of the rail sector, an opportunity for rail to contribute to wider hydrogen clusters by creating more demand for green hydrogen and in a way accelerating the development of this hydrogen economy in the UK and abroad.
Thanks, Bruno. And I'd like to bring Claire and Greg in, and I know that Greg's nodding a lot at that technology, and I know that he's mentioned he spends a lot of time looking at that, but I did want to stop on that policy piece because a couple of you guys have mentioned it. So in a way, as you've said, Philip, the past year and a half, some things have happened very quickly, like those trials and financing decisions have had to be a lot more mobile, but we've been waiting way longer than we thought for some of these bigger strategies, including the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, which came out a couple of weeks ago. So I'd love to really just take a temperature check on what people made of that and where the biggest remaining gaps are. And I think I should probably start with Claire, because you mentioned, Claire, that you were looking at your own manifesto in response in addition to that.
Yes, I mean, actually, it's really interesting just sort of picking up on what's already been discussed about some of the learnings from the pandemic that we really hope we can take, you know, the doing things differently. This is brilliant, isn't it, that we can just talk, it's so efficient. But there is a very real risk of a car-led recovery. I mean, the anti-public transport messaging obviously will have a lasting impact, inevitably. But I mean, I think that is something we really, and a lot of that is reflected. I mean, some of that, to avoid a car-led recovery is absolutely referenced in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, which is in many ways, a landmark publication. I mean, it's some world-leading targets to reduce emissions, to ban sales of new polluting road vehicles by 2040. I mean, that's very, exemplary. And, a lot of the vision around a cleaner, greener Britain. But I mean, the big criticism, I would say, is that it kind of, I would say, perpetuates the myth that technology will save us. That, I mean, and of course, all of this technological advance is crucial. Now, I'm not saying it isn't for 1 second, but to deliver the reductions in time, we have to factor in a big portion of behaviour change. And that, whilst alluded to in the plan, in a way, the takeout message, even though there's a lot of really great wording around, zero commute and all this, sort of planning, integrating land use planning with transport, to ensure that we don't build in congestion and all of those really important policy objectives. At the same time, it's sort of, the messaging was, we can still fly, you can adjust on cleaner planes, you can still drive and cleaner cars. And that was the overall thrust of it, which, so I would say in summary, it's a really welcome first step, and there's lots of great, messaging in there, but there's nothing on what we believe is the absolutely crucial. I mean, the behaviour change is really delegated to local authorities. I mean, and that's, go figure. All the difficult political stuff is just passed down the food chain, as it were. It really will require more leadership from central government on some of this. I mean, road pricing, and how are we going to manage this transition from, IC, from petrol and diesel cars to fully electric fleet? What's going to happen to that? The absence of the loss of fuel duty, VD, all that. How are we going to fill that black hole? How, all of that. The case for road pricing is really strong, and that should have come through in the plan. So no target for reducing car kilometres. I mean, Transport Scotland, the Scottish Government indeed has made a pledge to reduce car kilometres by 20% by 2030. No mention of anything like that in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. That's what we really need to push for, I believe.
Thanks, Claire. And then could I come on to you, Greg? So what was your take on the plan? What did you like, and what did you feel was missing?
Well, I think I would agree very much with everything that Claire has just said. This was a plan which was a very mixed bag, with some genuine world-leading announcements, such as the phase out of diesel trucks, and alongside earlier announcements on cars. And it has a great deal of good sentiment around the need to equalise the costs of public transport and motoring, encourage people to use their cars less, particularly in urban areas, and so forth. But what is lacking in this is a clear delivery plan for actually achieving many of these goals. It's coming on the electrification of vehicle side. Many of the proposals in the government's green paper that came out with the decarbonisation of transport plan are very good. But what we don't have is the same focus on how we're going to discourage people from encourage people driving less, and how we're going to bring about some of these equalisation of the costs of public transport with motoring. I would also say that the plans on aviation, and particularly the plans on shipping, which are absolutely stuck in the doldrums, are far weaker than many of the proposals which exist on electric cars and on new technology for vehicles. The aviation proposals in particular are relying upon technologies which are far from mature, but are assuming a very rapid uptake over the next 20 to 30 years. And I'm very fearful that the government, as Claire has said, has rather bet on these technologies emerging more quickly than they're likely to do, and not really bitten the bullet in terms of saying, if we're going to achieve our 6th carbon budget targets, then we're actually going to have to start to reduce car use, reduce flying, encourage people, more people onto the trains and so forth, in order to bring down our emissions more rapidly. So good on vehicles, awful on shipping, pretty poor on aviation, and good sentiments, but not enough action in relation to reducing car use.
I feel like I'm back at school, Greg. That's the sort of thing you'd get next to your subjects, isn't it? Very good at geography, could do better at maths. And I wanted to come on to the plan's implications and clarity for businesses there, because Greg, when you said, you know, we need more of a clear delivery plan still, and this is meant to be the delivery plan, I did see some nodding from elsewhere on my screen. So an open question, I guess, whoever would like to take it first, is, do you think that businesses and communities are grasping what this means at the moment from a national plan? And even at the moment, I think, Ruth, you flagged the IPCC report, which is obviously global. So are we able to translate this down into businesses and their systems, and what else needs to happen there?
I think the big elephant in the room, for me at least, is the funding. You know, going back to the railways, which is obviously my core interest, is, you know, there's plans to publish a plan for electrification, which is, you know, positive news, follows what's been recommended by Network Rail and the industry. But where is the budget coming from that? You know, and will the government finally consider, whether it's in railways or in other industries or sectors, the actual funding by alternative sources rather than from central government? And we've been having those discussions with government and with Network Rail and anyone else who wishes to discuss it with us, about Siemens Mobility could do this. We have the facilities to support third-party funding, but so far the government is not interested. And if there's going to be a finite level of budget, because obviously we have spent you know, much of our budget, rightfully so, supporting the economy to get through COVID, there will not be limitless budgets to actually fund anything, whether it's HGVs, whether it's scooters, whether it's railways, whatever it happens to be, aviation. And that, you know, I wonder whether the next comprehensive spending review, which is due in the autumn, will go any way to addressing that. Because from a business perspective, if we have no idea whether there's going to be any funding available, then it's always difficult to know which horse to bet on, if you like.
Of course, and if I could come on to maybe Bruno or Philip for their views on the plan and what that could mean for their business.
Should I go first? Or?
I think you just took your mute off first, Bruno, so I'll give it to you.
Well, I think generally speaking, we very much welcome the publication of the plan. Lots of good things in terms of ambitious targets, a recognition of the role that rail has to play in decarbonising the wider transport sector for passengers and freight, a commitment to electrification and a support for the deployment of hydrogen and battery trains. All of that is very good. Again, like Greg was saying, what we would very much like to see is more detailed delivery plans. Again, on electrification, there is the question of funding, which you raised, Ruth, but also the timing of that. Even if you go for the most ambitious electrification program, it's always going to take decades, minimum 30 years probably. If you're going to reach net zero by 2050, you can't afford to delay decision on that any longer. And this is the base that should provide businesses with the certainty to invest in the right alternative traction, the decision to invest or not invest in improving diesel assets in parallel, and that all goes down to having visibility over that long-term plan, against talking about the railways. So a good start, but a lot more to be done on the detailed delivery of this.
Got it. I have Greg raising his hand, so can I come to him super quickly before we go back to Philip?
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasise what Claire said about doing things differently in the future. And I think that's really important, that we actually reflect on how people travel and how that's going to change, and how we deliver services in the future and what we need to do that. So, for example, I think there's enormous opportunities to use technology to move towards more on-demand buses to complement traditional bus services which we've used in the past. I think there has to be ways that we can make our rail system more efficient than it is at the moment and better integrate it into other transport modes. I don't think we should hide the fact that 10% of passenger kilometres are on the rail, but 50% of public spending on transport goes to the rail system. So we need to be honest about these things and acknowledge the fact that in the future, if rail is going to compete with aviation and driving, we've got to bring those costs down, we've got to bring those subsidies down, and we've got to think, as a result of the pandemic, how we can work differently in these sectors to make them more efficient and make them more attractive to people. We shouldn't just accept that we go back to doing what we've done in the past, but probably with fewer passengers.
That makes complete sense. And yeah, I did notice myself in the plan that on buses, it essentially said, well, we're consulting for the national bus strategy, so you'll have to wait a little bit longer. But thanks for coming in, Greg. I did want to just touch on Philip and his take on the plans.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess with regards to the plans and then what comes next is the funding. I guess just sort of, this might be a bit of a question for the other panelists who know more about this than me. But it strikes me that like a big sort of ambition from the public funding is to crowd in private funding to deliver it. And it feels like every morning now I wake up to like an industry newsletter that has said like new EV charging point company XYZ has raised another 200 million, 500 million. They've just SPAC'd for 2 billion or something like that. Like it feels like that's like done its job on the EV charging stuff. I don't know, I could be wrong there. So I guess that's a question to the panel to say like where's the bottom of the barrel on that one? And I guess it sort of links to that point that's Greg saying, because the more and more stuff that happens like that, it's like it's just re-embedding the same transport behaviours. It's just re-embedding like the car every single time, albeit, you know, an electric car at that point. Which is obviously better, but then yeah, the way that we view our business, you know, moving people on like things that weigh between like 15 kilos and 35 kilos, it's obviously still like massively inefficient from the perspective of a bike or something like that. So yeah, I guess that's the bit that I sort of struggle with all of the plan. And the conversation, government conversation, and then also like the private financing that where it is at the minute is still just sort of reinforcing the same behaviours over and over. So that's my observation. But yeah, I don't know if anyone can tell me like, actually, no, Phil, you're wrong. We still need absolutely loads more capital continually always going to EV charging before, just because we're nowhere near, you know, where we need to be yet. I don't know.
I've got Ruth and Greg raising hands. I'll go to Ruth first and then Greg on that one.
I can't so much pick up on the EV charging point, although our traffic solutions business does have some interest in that. But I think in terms of funding, looking at alternative ways of funding the railways and taking up Greg's point on it being more efficient, if the funding is provided by the party who is delivering and they are then responsible for the outputs for however long it is afterwards, there is definitely far more of an incentive on those parties to actually get it right and deliver it efficiently. And at the moment, the traditional model is, although it's moving a bit, is, you know, competitive procurement happens, people provide prices, they deliver, and then 2 years after the end of the delivery, they walk away from it. So there is less of an incentive for them to actually come up with something very different and innovative. And we need to work as an industry to actually come up with something that works better than the current system. Otherwise, as Greg says, we will continue to spend significant amounts of money in the same way. But it's pushing at, you know, our particular blocker at the moment appears to be Treasury, who are nervous about government balance sheet issues. I shall stop at that point because I'm outside my expert area.
And I'll come on to Greg for that. I would come in myself, but really I'm not an expert on this, but something I have seen is that as much as we think of innovation as these technologies, there's an increasing recognition that it needs to be of systems and how things are set up as well. So looking at innovative financial products and flows as well. And there's a sort of hope that we are in the moment where decisions have to be nimble and agile and taken differently. We are seeing like council-led green bonds, which are bubbling away in the background. But yeah, if I could come back to Greg, I know you had your hand up.
So in relation to Philip's point about electric charging, I mean, what I would say is that the vast majority of investment that is going in at the present time is coming from the private sector. And that is likely to be even more so in the future. The state of the UK's charging infrastructure is actually much better than it's often given credit for. We do actually have over 25,000 charge points already in the UK. We have fast charging infrastructure at all our motorway service areas and a lot more going in every week. We probably need to double the amount of charging infrastructure in order to have a decent network by around 2025, and that particularly means addressing some of the black holes in the network which exist at a local authority level, where we have some local authorities doing excellently and some really making no contribution towards developing this network at all. But I think overall what you can say is that we will see a reduction over the next few years in government spending on the shift to electric cars in particular, and we will see the private sector stepping up and making those investments overwhelmingly.
Thanks, Greg. And I see we've got just over 10 minutes left on our call today, so I do want to turn our eyes really to COP26 and what's actually going to be happening there, and look at really what the UK can do in terms of leadership as host. As we've mentioned, the plan isn't perfect, but it is there. Boris Johnson has come up with this slogan, I think it's coal, cars, cash and trees, intending to get other countries to set car phase out dates. So I'd like to ask what the UK can do to accelerate the transition abroad, essentially, and equally what other nations can bring. So is there a particularly strong case study that could be brought to Glasgow, and what could we learn from others? I don't know who'd like to come in first on that one.
I mean, I'm happy to just jump in and give other people a chance to think. I just sort of think it's important to do a reality check on where we really are, because I think the most important thing that we need to do at COP26 is set an example to the rest of the world in terms of keeping our own side of the street clean. And the reality is we're making a mess. I mean, despite the fact is that transport emissions are 4% higher than in 2013 and only 3% lower than 1990. I think there's just about up to date this number, that we haven't made much progress, which DFT is quite upfront and admits. It's a really hard nut to crack. No one's suggesting otherwise, but let's be clear, it is the fastest growing source of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's the biggest emitting sector of the UK economy. 90% of emissions are from roads, so we really do need to look at what we do on the roads. And we know that the efficiency gains that have been absolutely made in terms of cleaner vehicles have been, outweighed really by increased use, shift to more SUVs, larger vehicles. So we're sort of, we've got a really big challenge on our hands, despite the progress that is being made and the laudable targets that are being set. So I would say the biggest thing the UK could do would be to crack a really hard nut, and that is to implement a national road pricing scheme. It's politically really difficult. We all know that. We have to look to replace those revenues anyway, from fuel duty and so forth. But crucially, if we don't introduce road pricing at the same time as rolling out EVs, because of the lower running costs of a car, essentially congestion will increase, public transport use will go down, emissions will, it's a big own goal if we don't price at the same time as electrifying the fleet. Now, I know that's on our own turf, but that's the example, I believe, the big one that we need to set. I think that's what I would just want to throw out there. I don't know what others think. That's what I think we ought to do.
I would look at the other end of the scale, and I would say the really big contribution that this COP could make to reducing global transport emissions is by really making clear to ICAO in the case of aviation emissions and the IMO in relation to shipping emissions, that they either come up with a credible plan to globally decarbonise these sectors, or nations around the world will step up and will start to implement their own policies, whether at a national or a regional level. Because both of those organisations, ICAO and the IMO, have singularly failed in their responsibilities to bring forward credible decarbonisation plans. They are immensely slow and industry-dominated organisations, which makes them unfit for the responsibilities that they've been given. And I would like to see this COP send a very clear signal to those two international organisations that either they make rapid progress to bring forward really credible plans, or they can expect to be sidelined in relation to the pace of change which needs to happen, because quite simply, they haven't been up to the job.
I see lots of nodding there, and obviously, Claire, you said the elephant in the room is the fact that this is a very high emitting sector, but for a long time it's also been what's been called creative carbon accounting with the shipping and the aviation as well. So thank you for raising that, Greg. I see, Bruno, that you've come off mute, so can I come on to you next?
Yeah, I was just going to raise the point that obviously the UK government has a massive role to play, and quite a unique opportunity to set the bar really high for other countries to follow. But equally, I think other countries and cities and businesses have an opportunity ahead of the conference to create momentum towards the transition to net zero, for example, by signing up to very ambitious target, but also at the conference, which should be about exchanging ideas and best practice in terms of reducing emissions. For example, we'll be bringing the Hydroflex train at the conference in November in partnership with Network Rail, and very much looking forward to demonstrating what a very promising application in terms of hydrogen technology, as well as showcasing the best of British engineering in terms of decarbonisation there.
Thanks, Bruno. And if I could come on to Ruth.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, echo a lot of what's already been said. That if we can't persuade people to change their behaviours, maybe we need to have the stick approach, if you like, in terms of road pricing, because it will solve two issues. I think we've tried to an extent to make passenger transport more attractive and convenient and reliable. I think the challenge that we have nationally, at least, is that the cost of public transport, if you compare it to some of our European cities, is exponential. And so unless public transport, and I'm talking more about the railways necessarily than, say, the metro systems, becomes more affordable, persuading people to leave their cars unless road pricing is horrendous, it won't happen. So you've really got to weigh that up. It's the convenience, but also the cost. If you look at a family of 4 people, they've got to pay 4 times. I know there are season tickets and cards and all the rest of it, but it doesn't really work. And then in terms of just picking up sort of COP26, I actually chaired a round table with other industry parties around a similar topic a couple of months ago. And we actually invited some people from Norway who actually work for Bane Nor, who are the equivalent of Network Rail, but in Norway. And they were telling us that they had managed, you know, with their carbon emissions in transport to actually reduce them by 10% in a single year. Appreciate it's a smaller population, but even so, that's a large number. And the 2 key things that they were looking at, picking up on Greg's shipping point, they had electric ferries and they had hydrogen ferries in service, not just being thought about. And then they had electric vehicles. There was actually an incentive to go and get them as well, rather than just a sort of, you know, that there isn't, I don't think there's quite the same incentive policy in the UK. So I think there's definitely some examples from Norway. And then the other one, again, it's Siemens are very much involved in this. This is the highway solution. We're currently working on a feasibility study funded by the government to consider whether actually e-highways with electric road systems are a real potential for the UK or not, given that HGVs are the second most polluting part of transport after cars and taxis. And we do have to find a shift, because I think it was Greg who said, or maybe it was Claire, so apologies, you know, there's a target for 2040, but what's happening? Well, they're going to consult on it. And, you know, we could move some of the freight to rail, that's great. But you're not going to move all the freight to rail, because there won't be space and capacity, even if High Speed 2 comes online as planned, and so on and so on. So there does need to be a bit more of a plan in terms of how we're going to deal with HGVs.
Got it. And I'm conscious that I've left Philip till last, so I'll finish with you again. So yeah, thoughts and hopes for COP26, please. I
guess my point might be, yeah, sort of slightly simplistic in that I think, I don't know, it feels like optimistically maybe it's a bit of an opportunity to mobilise public opinion towards one of sort of mobilising public opinion from awareness to sort of an expectation of implementation as well, perhaps. So yeah, I think a couple of points. Yeah, one thing that Claire said is, you know, taking it as an opportunity to shine a light on ourselves, and yeah, whether that can help to mobilise public opinion. And also, yeah, I think what Bruno said is right. Is like, you know, and maybe reflecting on this myself, opportunity for organisations to sort of speak out, I suppose, to the customer base that we have and our communities, and sort of, yeah, stress that there is this thing coming, and start to mobilise that public opinion. And if yeah, I think I don't know how well mobilised it is at the minute. You know, everyone is now at a point where there's an opinion, but not necessarily an expectation of implementation from these sorts of things. And so, yeah, maybe a bit simplistic, but probably quite important, and a bit of an opportunity for us to, yeah, hopefully try to do some of that.
Thanks, Philip. And I think it is worth ending on a slightly hopeful note, at least, after so much to unpack. That's all we have time for our panel today. So thank you all for taking part, and thank you again to Siemens Mobility for sponsoring. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.